The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
So I've got a lot of content that I'm sending your way over the next couple of days. Today is part one of a conversation that I had with Professor Matt Sinkowitz. We had an hour-long conversation, and it's about the lanes that are afforded to individuals in this power structure, and particularly from the perspective of independent media. And it's a really robust conversation, and we do get into a lot of different facets of it, but I'm pretty confident that you can hang with the conversation because, I mean, it's pretty much what I do on a regular basis, but just imagine with two people chasing tangents that are relevant, that are, by definition, tangential, and they elucidate more of what we're trying to explain, but there's no lane that we don't go after to explore this idea of the role that we as individuals play in participating in this power structure, even when we think we are anti-establishment, right? And just to give you a quick synopsis, at the conclusion of this, we came to an agreement that there's the liberal progressive establishment, there's the conservative establishment, and there's the anti-establishment establishment. And all three of those lanes play a very specific role, fulfill a very specific function to the power structure. And sometimes those that we think are independent are far from it in terms of how they carry out a role, how they fulfill a role for the power structure. That's just today's conversations. I actually had another conversation Saturday with two friends of mine, Aaron and Q, who are coming out with a podcast really soon, and we went into great detail about the problem of dismissing identity politics, particularly in the independent media spaces. I'm going to get that one fully edited and out to you this week as well. So here's a conversation one that I had with Professor Matt Sinkowitz. I'm here at a coffee shop with Boston native.
That's right. Matt
Sinkowitz, who's down south. He's dressed appropriately. You look like you're ready to go to a very hot summer baseball game.
Yes. No. I like the South because you can dress like this.
Yeah.
And like
it's appropriate.
And up north we.
I'm just like I'm still up north.
Yeah. You have to pretend that it's like the middle of winter, even if you can't be sweaty.
So when we come back from this baseball game, I'm going to be completely drenched. I can already tell that, but that's fine. So we were having a conversation. We decided to open the microphone and continue the conversation. And I think it's really relevant because it's the things that I've been talking to my audience about, particularly about decisions that I've made over the last few years that absolutely hurt how much I could be making right now, and it's totally fine. This is not like begrudging those decisions, but it's like being fully aware that this is the climate. And so let me describe it before I keep talking about how I feel about it. Basically, there's a role that a lot of media want individuals to play, and it's usually a role of your identity playing against your identity.
Sure.
It's like you're a black person who goes against the grain of other black people. And in 2016, they really were looking for people who would go against the grain, against black Democratic establishment types.
Right.
Come and enter in me, Noah Changa, Brandon Sutton, the entire Progressive Army team. That's who we were. That's who we are, right? We are as anti-establishment as you can be without being, I don't know, on the fringe.
Oh, it's still being legible to people who are sort of, engaged in a more normal way, right? Normative way. Yeah.
That's, you put it perfectly. I don't even have to re-say it. And, of course there are characters out on the fringes who are anti-establishment, but they really don't have much to offer into the discourse, in my opinion. And so there was a high demand for voices like mine and Noah at the time. And after the election, we just really
followed what was going on in the country, which was, we have a problem with a lot of the decisions that some establishment players make, particularly the Democratic establishment. But we have a brand new fire on our hand right now.
Right.
Like, on our hands. We have some issues, like, this is literally, well, not literally, but very figuratively, it feels like we're sitting in Rome burning, and it would be so irresponsible for us to sit back and play the fiddle of anti-establishment politics, anti-democratic establishment politics, when Donald Trump is gutting everything that he can.
Right.
So we read the lay of the land, and we noticed that people still wanted us to play the same card and do the same dance that we weren't doing a dance, we were doing what was legitimately an issue at the time.
Right. It just so happened at that moment to fit the needs of the news system, for lack of a better
Exactly.
term.
And so you came to Atlanta. We're going to hang out. You also came on business. You had a chance to talk with Anoa. We'll leave the majority of that for the book.
Yeah, but I'd be happy to sort of fill in.
So go ahead and show us how we got on this conversation.
Yeah. So I had a nice. So I'm working on this book project. It's going to. I'm an academic, so I'm a professor at Boston College. It takes years to get stuff out, so it's like it's not a quick hit thing.
Okay.
But I'm working on a project, and the question basically is, what are different responses that Americans and American institutions are taking towards this threat of America's media dominance? The idea that we could be infiltrated by the Russians, the idea that ISIS, could be infiltrating our social media, these kinds of things. So what are the responses? And a lot of them are, hunting Russian trolls, stuff like that, which is it's fun stories, and you can critique them also, and of course I do that. But one other response has been, of course, to sort of freak out, like sort of lose your mind about the possibility that the Russians could be infiltrating our media system. And Anoa had an experience where her being an occasional guest on a Sputnik show.
Radio Sputnik.
Yeah.
And the show with Eugene Puryear, who's like a friend of all of ours.
Yeah. Just her being on there created this stir, brought on by NPR, and a sort of classic American media institution, that somehow that she was being used by the Russians, perhaps, or whatever the case might be. And that will do for the book, and that's fine. But how that relates, I think, really cleanly to what we have here is in talking to her and talking to you and sort of researching this, phenomenon. It certainly seems that during particularly the primaries, right, there was...
Especially in the primaries.
Yeah, there was an interest in particularly minority voices, African-American voices, if they were going to talk about white people.
Yeah.
Right. If you're going to talk about Bernie, if you're going to be sort of tokenistic, somewhat like it's like it's the perfect media combination, in that it's really just about the main hegemonic story, which is the two leading, in this case, white candidates, right? But it's got enough of a twist, right? That's what American media does. It gives you the same old thing with a little tiny twist, and
something new for the news cycle.
Right, exactly. And the new thing for the news cycle, for a period of time, it seems to me, standing from the outside, you can tell me what it looks like from the inside. The new thing was like, African Americans are turning against the Democratic establishment. So we keep the same story. We don't fundamentally talk about the voter suppression or whatever issues that would fundamentally relate to the sort of relationship between race and democracy. So they don't want you to talk about that, right?
No.
They're happy to have you come on and talk about the white guy and how he's running against the white lady, the dominant people, and be sort of a gimmick, a twist, a token. And then as soon as the story changes, you can either chase that, and be Candace Owens, maybe, right?
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. Like, the logical extension of that is the Candace Owens of the world. Like, she had an epiphany, and I've turned against the Democratic establishment and all this. And, we can get into the nuances of maybe she's the smart one because she's collecting the check.
Her bank account, her accountant thinks that she is the smart one.
She's the smart one.
That's for sure.
But it's very reactionary, and it's very opportunistic. And as soon as that narrative is no longer needed, then she no longer has a job.
She'll have to,
or she'll chase the next one.
She'll chase the next one, right? And part of this, and I think that you sort of you put you made a joke about her accountant, and I think given who she is defending right now, she deserves a lot of jokes, probably. However, right, if you want to make a living, if your craft is media commentary, politics, well, in her case, demagoguery, but let's say in your case, I don't know, it's just, then if you actually want to make a living at it, right, the overall media structure for all we talk about the ways in which digital technology, social media has democratized it, the same dominant sort of corporate structures there, the narratives, they change a little bit here and there. They're not so different, right? If you want to have a fruitful part in that, you have to find a role that fits into it. Yeah. And what makes you interesting, right? What makes her interesting is very clear, right? It's her identity versus the identity of the people she's defending. Exactly. Who seem to hate people of her identity. It's very complicated.
And that's why she makes the big bucks.
Yeah. She can find something new, though. Once that turns on that, there'll be a new place to go.
So, and that's the decision point that you have to have, right? There's a turning point where you decide, am I chasing, like you said, chasing the narrative, or am I telling my story and interpreting the narrative as I see it, regardless of how the winds change? And those are some of the key decision points that I made. The winds changed politically. America changed in 2016
for sure,
in a very significant fashion, and it wasn't sufficient enough for us to just keep it. I think it's inadequate. I think it's insufficient for a person to view 2018 through the same lens that you viewed 2016. Just from a critical analysis perspective, just from just objectively speaking, like you can argue that that's subjective, but I just think objectively speaking, it's irresponsible to interpret 2018 through the same lens as 2016, and that's what's profitable, though. Yeah. If you look at the people who are successful right now in the independent media space, you're either well established and you've been here forever,
right? In which case, independent.
They can talk about whatever.
They're independent in one sense, but they're establishment in another sense, right?
Exactly. And there's
going to be some space for that as like a market alternative, right? There's going to be some people. I mean, and they could be quite good, but right, there's going to be indie music acts because some people don't want to feel like they're listening to Drake or whatever, right? They want to feel cooler than that.
But at the end of the day, they're still
part of the system.
It's still part of the system.
And there's nothing wrong with it.
And that's the Young Turks, right? And there's nothing wrong with it. They have their space. But they are established and they've been there long enough to where they can just talk about whatever they want to talk about.
Yeah, it's an established space.
Emerging spaces, the space where you can move up from nothing to the front, is really, at least on the progressive side of the aisle, there are people who can continuously view 2018 through the lens of 2016, point everything back to what happened in 2016, point everything back to the Democratic Party establishment, rigging the primaries, and that seems to be the most lucrative space right now because people are still angry, but I mean, anger politics sells.
It's also a way to anger sells, right? Conflict sells. There is also the idea that news stories need stars, just like movies need stars, right? And it's not really clear what the news stars that have emerged are. There's candidates for them, right? But the ones that are still leading, it might not be, it's even still, honest to God, it's still Bernie, it's still Hillary. These are the, so how are you going to find a way to be a bit player in that story? It's to find a relationship to that star.
To everything has a relationship. Yeah, or villain.
Yeah, villains are stars too. Yeah, antagonist, protagonist. Yeah, absolutely. You could.
Yeah, I just want to make sure throw that out there because if you say, you're from that perspective, absolutely right. If you can make everything about someone who's in that establishment, then from your angle, there's a place for you. But I think the interesting thing that you already said is that makes you a part of the establishment all the same. You're just playing a role. Yeah, you have a role to play in the structure, the system that's structured the way it is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's... And again, I mean, none of us do... if you work for a living, some aspect of your work is not of the exact ethical, rotation. It's not exactly what you do.
It's not. Yeah,
right. Yeah. So
none of us are pure.
Exactly. I mean, I definitely don't want to make it sound like, oh, well, I don't make compromises, and the people who fit in them, of course, I do. Of course, everybody does. However, that doesn't, just because nobody's pure doesn't mean that virtue doesn't exist, right? Yeah. And you see the spots that have opened up. I don't know. I'm very hesitant to critique just knowing, especially when we're talking about marginalized identities. racial minorities in particular, there's just historically very few slots.
Yeah,
and if it's hard for me to critique it, but to say like if somebody does choose to fit into one of those, well, you got to make a living, you got to eat.
Yeah, I mean, and honestly, and we were joking about Candace, but I'm gonna be honest with you, like she, I mean, of course, she sold her entire soul, but but you know, I said this a couple of years ago, who's really the dumb ones in this equation, right? The Bakari Sellers, who everyone says, oh, he's a sellout. Yeah, but his checking account from CNN probably looks really pretty strong. And he's part of the mainstream establishment. He doesn't really risk anything.
Right. You would differentiate him from Candace Owens.
Oh, absolutely.
Right,
absolutely. No, there's a lot of varying degrees of this, right? You have your regular and roles to play. Like, Bakari has a role that he plays in this structure, and it's a safe one.
And it perpetuates the structure, right? So if you're a radical, you find that
offensive.
It's really offensive.
Really offensive.
Right? Yeah.
And then you have the Candace Owens, who's like, she has a role to play. No. There's always been a Candace Owens. Just it seems different now because of social media, but there's always been that spot to be filled. Before it was Larry Elder. You know, he filled that role very similarly in the past. So
right, I mean, yes, I think that's totally right. It's one, the social media thing is a huge aspect of it. Two, the reversion back to more or less overt racism from the highest echelons of the American government. Right? That does amp up the stakes of playing that role. Maybe it doesn't change the morality because hidden racism's better.
The role is the same, right? The role is the same. Is have a okay, I want to be clear. Like, this plays itself out in every culture and every race. And we were talking about how some people invited you to speak on a particular program, and it was like they wanted you to fill a particular role. Right. And so, and I want to get into that a little bit more later. But from the black perspective, it has always been about: are you going to be a establishment player? Play by the rules, then there are great rewards for you.
For sure.
Are you going to be are you going to go against the grain? Are you going to be the anti-hero kind of thing, or a straight-out villain?
But who fits into the overall?
Still inside the same structure.
Who sort of accepts the terms and just decides to play
the opposite role.
But
right.
still,
Right. Or, totally different people in terms of, it's depending on where you're standing, your vantage point. I clearly don't see Bakari as the same as Candace. They're completely antithetical. But in the sense that they are both playing roles in this structure.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a nice way of putting it, right? That it doesn't make them morally equivalent either. But on one level, they're very different. Right. In that, I mean, I think that's sort of the adhering to moral standards that you can at least consider. Yeah. Right. One is doing that, and one is really not, so far as I can tell. However, insofar as they are both perpetuating the existing system, like the existing news cycles, for example, right? Because what do they need? They need to have a little bit of conflict. They need to have somebody to come in and stir up things from different directions. They need somebody to cool it off, which maybe that's Bakari Sellers' role at times.
Well, I have to think yes and no, because I think we may have stretched Bakari to the limits of how he fits into this. Because I think, please. I mean, he's really, and no, I want to say that because now there was a new lane that was created in 2016 and 15 in the primaries. It was, I'm not establishment. I'm certainly not conservative. But I am a black person, and there's a nice lane here for me if I play this role. And that role was the generally what I call the anti-identity politics black person. That's a good way to put it. Third lane seemed radical, but as we came to find out over the last 2 years, it's just as much a part of the structure of this system. It's just a different lane.
I think that's, I mean, you've said it far better than I ever could. I think that's what I meant by kind of cool it off, in the extent that, like, you've got, I mean, I think that a lot of our current conflict in terms of news stories is the battle between identity politics, just in the news stories. I'm not talking about activists. I'm talking about identity politics versus some anti-identity politics that's really extreme, right? It's really sort of denies any factor of racism still exists or whatever.
Well, it's actually you have identity politics, and let's create the lanes. Like we're like freestyle theorizing here, right? Okay, so you have the lane generally on the left, democratic establishment, we recognize identity and it's important.
Yeah.
And then you have the land on the right, which claims to be anti-identity politics, but it's very much identity.
Yeah, sure.
White male supremacy identity. That's their, it's a white identitarian,
Right. I think that there's a side lane to that, which is like the Reason magazine crowd, which really at least has convinced itself it's not doing that. But maybe you could argue they still are.
They absolutely.
Fair.
I've gone to Reason and be like, "Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Is this?
I'm not.
Their logic breaks down when it comes.
I agree. I guess all I want to differentiate there is the Reason crowd from sort of the alt-right crowd. The alt-right crowd sort of leans into the white supremacy thing in the way that Reason will tuck under.
I think Reason. I would give them. I can see why you want to make that distinction.
Yeah.
I would say that they are better than the Ben Shapiros, but they serve the same role as the Ben Shapiro.
I mean,
it is to provide intellectual cover for the same structure that has always been here. You're rarely going to see anyone from Reason arguing against the current structure.
No, it's pretty remarkable how a world in which they acknowledge most people are irrational, right? That's what they're so angry about. Mm-hmm. Yet somehow the system that's developed is
from it
is perfectly. That one can't really be challenged,
exactly.
Right? So everything is the way it needs to be, even though everybody is not the way.
Right.
The opposite of the way they should be. Yeah.
And to me, that's the role they're facilitating from the right, leaning towards the right. Yeah. But okay, so and I can totally respect why you want to make that distinction, because they're qualitatively they're different.
Well, what I would
but
say,
they still serve the system.
There are some questions that people like that can answer with some level of validity. They tend to be technical questions about solving it. I mean, they invoke reason, which is often useful, I guess. I think that they're bifurcated. I think that
yes, I agree.
Yeah, there's elements of it which are honestly trying to sort something out.
And then they also fall into the same trap.
Basically, what they do is that they accept premises,
and the premises are rooted in the. And identitarian.
Right. And from there, they go and they sort of work them out logically, as opposed to...
I wonder if the audience is still following us, because we've really gone on some tangents.
It's pretty rough. Anyway,
no, we're going to bring it back in.
Back to the lane.
Up.
So anyway, I'm not...
Well, okay, so let's qualify the lane, because that lane that we just got through talking about is really important. And I hope the audience is following us, because on the right, there are those, I want to say... The William F. Buckley model, I think, is what Reason tries to fill into. That's what it wants to be. And no matter how rational and no matter how well thought out his argumentation was, he still defended the structure.
Yeah, and that normally is that there is some thing he's accepting that one could question. Or to get really deep about it, there's a question of whether that thing itself is reason.
Mm-hmm. Yes,
but I don't want to do that right now. I just want to say that he thinks the world is made up of less than it really is. Like people like Buckley don't include. Here's a. I think maybe this will tie it back to something a little bit more accessible. Ben Shapiro, facts don't care about your feelings thing. Yeah, I mean, fine, you can say that, but feelings are facts.
Right.
Exactly. Like, people have emotional lives, and those emotional lives are facts. So you can say facts don't care about your feelings. That's not an excuse to get rid of, the fact that people have subjective lives.
And we see that approach used to protect the structure.
Oh, absolutely.
And in that way, they are all facilitating a role in the establishment.
Right.
Their role is to protect that structure,
right.
which I generally refer to as a white male Christian supremacist structure in America.
Because that they want to boil down any way in which that doesn't work out for you as your feelings being hurt.
Yes.
Not your children not having enough.
Yes. So there's never anything wrong with the structure.
Yeah.
It's always something wrong with you.
It's the way you're reacting to it, right?
Right.
And if you showed more initiative, if you didn't get so emotional,
if you didn't, all the things. If you waited till you were 30 and got married,
exactly. If you thought about what the optimum time is to have children, you wouldn't have these problems.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Which is like, whatever.
So I still, because they're protecting that structure, that
Fair
structure
enough.
is a white male Christian supremacist structure in America, then I'd say they are not anti-identity politics. They're just pro-white identity politics. They may not be the extreme neo-Nazi.
Yeah.
But they're still in that spectrum in that they're trying to protect the same structure that the neo-Nazis trying to protect.
Yeah. No, I mean, for sure. I mean, it's where Shapiro does get complicated, right? And that he's not
really
Christian.
weird.
He's
really
not
weird.
Christian.
Exactly.
And
that's and that's that conversation that we had. Like, there's this weird marriage that has been happening on the right across the globe between atheists, people of the Jewish faith, Judaism, and Christianity.
Absolutely.
And I already said atheists, but it's
you can make an argument that the Erdogans of the world who are stoking Islam inflected supremacy.
I think it's fundamental. It's
in the same boat, right?
It's that intersection of fundamentalism, of generally male structures, generally
overwhelmingly.
I'm just trying to
not exclusively, but like all overwhelming.
Yeah,
you've got to
it's safe for me to say that
fits in or whatever,
right?
But it's pretty
few and far and in between. Okay. So the reason we went off on that was probably like a 20-minute tangent. Well, not really. We only been recording for 20 minutes. It's about a 10-minute tangent, but it was because we sort of disagreed on whether or not they were really anti-identity politics. My argument is that they are just pro. And actually, if we were to generalize it and make it applicable to more than just like white identity, I would say pro whatever the power structure, the identity of the power structure. That's what they're looking to preserve, the identity of the power structure.
I mean, you can go down a very sort of Marxist route. They don't want to give up their
stuff.
I
guess that is where we're headed, right?
Well, that is to a certain extent, right? That it's just like that. If we're going to acknowledge something is wrong, then that has a very material consequence, right?
Okay.
And it doesn't, I think that this is really half baked, which is maybe what a lot of I've said so far.
We're just freestyling. This will not be entered into any of the.
We're not going to peer review this stuff.
No, nothing. Nothing's going to be submitted for review.
One way to theorize it, right, is that during sort of the early post-Soviet years, where the world was liberalizing and it looked like maybe the pie could just grow forever, then it's not as threatening to have different identity groups claiming their share, right? Because
once you realize the limitations,
you realize that I mean, and some of it could be as much as like the Earth's limitations,
right?
And those things too, but also just that we've gone through economic shocks, right? And those economic shocks have told us that there's going to be moments where the pie is not so big,
right?
And if we're going to allow all these various groups to get their slice, well, there's only one answer: when if the pie doesn't grow, then your slice gets smaller.
So it's interesting. So now you actually do bring me to the group that wants to be anti-identity politics, because the Democrat establishment, the left, definitely identity politics focused, right? I argue that they are identity focused, but they're focused on the power identity of protecting the identity of the power structure, or rather protecting the power structure for their identity. I think would probably be a little more precise. But then there was a lane, all the way to come back to this, the lane that appeared to be radical, but I think based on all of our conversations, we're learning that it isn't, and that was people who would play the truly anti-identity politics role, not for the sake of fitting into either camp.
I see what you're saying now.
No camp, but just like, here's a lane that, let's focus on class, let's focus on, this role that Anoa and I played, quite frankly, and that was amplified when we had some time at the Intercept, and they really loved it that we were, and then once they just, not just them, but other folks, they discovered, they're not really, Ben and Anoa aren't really anti-identity politics.
I see. So they read you, okay. Well,
they read us wrong.
Yeah, they read you wrong. And they read you, well, partially because your affinity for Bernie, who was read, and I think fairly accurately read as being that lane that you described. This is the old left. Right. This is like the left.
It's a throwback.
The left that maybe actually did read a little Marx in college, understood a little bit, right? That the idea that the only identity that really matters is that economic identity. It's the where you stand on a material basis. I think you're right, and there's always been plenty of white leftists in that space.
Right.
I mean, that's. They mostly in academia, in all honesty, right? And still, you'll see every so often you'll see a book by a professor like a Mark Lilla or somebody like this against identity politics, and it's almost always just a call to return to a pretty basic class-based Marxist class consciousness.
Right.
And it's interesting when you say Bakari's not a Marxist
by long,
but he is that. So there might be that lane might be wide too and have different politics in it.
Oh yeah,
but it's like a fairly authentic. I like this idea, right? That there's that space that's authentically against identity politics. Thinks it's a problem, not using it as an excuse to just try to keep the structure as is. So that's like your middle lane, and that could have sub-lanes, right, to get even more complicated. Bakari's in there somewhere.
Bakari, well, so right now we're dealing with 3 lanes, right?
Yeah.
We're doing we almost got us a super highway right here.
Yeah.
We've got the identity politics matter. So here's where the conflict comes in.
Yeah.
Conflict comes in on the left, where you have, and it's funny, this anti-identity politics class consciousness lane actually does intersect with the right. You do have some people on the left who, once we get into that identity space, they have as much disdain for it as you hear people on the right. Yep. And you also have people making the argument that if we get past identity, we can work with the right for the sake of class.
That's the part that makes no sense to me.
It makes no sense, but it's a lane that has been, resurrected over and over again over the last 2 years. And this is where we find ourselves like stuck in limbo, particularly not really in limbo. We've already made our decision. Noah's made her decision. I've made my decision. It's like we're not really in here to cater to any of these lanes. Now the problem is these lanes are well established.
Yeah,
there's money behind these lanes. Right, they're the one with the platforms.
Yeah.
They're the ones with the funding. That, and you got to get, if you don't get in one of those lanes, you miss out.
No, that makes sense. And I think for all of our kind of like trying to build this big architecture of the road, what I'm taking from what you're saying primarily is that you working in the world of media, you see the division of it being really a relationship to identity politics.
I would say that's at least one of the core
issues. Major aspect of it.
I mean, it'd be funny if we deconstruct it, and at the end of the day, identity politics is all that's left. That would be hilarious to me for some reason. I don't know that that's the case. I would just say this is at least one issue.
It's one way to define. Yeah. It's one way to define who you are, and I think. So here's why that's so interesting to me.
Especially, I guess, in media, more so than anything else.
That's why it's interesting, right? Because the very brief history of American media, American broadcasting, right, is a it wasn't that long ago that all media was localized and specialized, pre-World War II, essentially. And that sounds pretty far back, but it's not
unreasonably far.
Yeah, right. You know people who remember this.
Yeah.
It was rather localized. Like there were national magazines and things, but it was really just emerging the idea of having sort of a broad, undifferentiated audience, right? And then from the period of World War II up until the 70s, early 80s, the idea was that you would broadcast just to everybody, basically, right? And that meant mostly broadcasting and making magazines and stuff mostly for white people with like a feature that would attract this group or that group. But basically, the idea was keeping it all under one umbrella. Subsequent to that, like more recently, media is about finding a specific demographic, carving up that audience into a small little piece and getting devotion from that audience. So there was a period of time where media was about being passable to a lot of people, right? Just being like kind of, okay, cool, I'll watch that show. Now we're at the extreme version where media is about finding pretty tight audience, even for like mainstream media, pretty tight audience, and getting them completely devoted to it. So even if it's not explaining our entire political system, the fact that you in the world of political media, you say identity, I think of it as demographics.
Right, yeah, exactly.
And it makes sense. So it's not totally out of nowhere that it would be identity over these other issues, because that is the way we tend to do demographics. Most strongly, right?
Yeah. I think we actually piece something together here. I don't know.
All right, that was part one, and this conversation is it's not the news cycle conversation, and it's not what's happening in the news right now. It's not Donald Trump, so it's not as exciting, but I think it's critical. Later on, we're going to discuss in more detail about the decisions people make in order to not only have their voice heard, but to just simply have their voices heard. Whether or not there's a great distinction between those two. And then we explore stories that we've covered about Glenn Greenwald going on Fox News and using that platform as opposed to any other platform. And so what we were creating here, just in casual conversation, really is just a framework of understanding the why in terms of media. And this is critical in the sense that this media space, particularly this independent media space, is wrought with some of the same problems that we have in mainstream media. I mean, that is critical to understand, that some of the same problems that we complain about in mainstream media exist in this independent media space. And because this independent media space is ostensibly critical to the role of speaking truth to power, well, how can it speak truth to power when it functions almost exactly like the main power structure? And that part of the conversation is coming up, and it also leads into the conversation that I had with Q and Aaron last week, on Saturday rather, about the problems in independent media and independent media looking exactly like mainstream media. It matters. This identity matters even more so in media. But anyway, that's it for today. We'll pick up part 2 of the conversation tomorrow. I'm still editing the conversation with Q and Aaron. So like I said, there's a lot of content that I discussed over the weekend that I want to give to you. And that's it. All right. We'll talk to you soon.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.